I've always been the type of individual that people tend to overlook, those who believe they're superior, laughing at their own success while sipping expensive wine. I let them believe it. It's easier that way. Because if they knew the truth, if they saw me for what I truly am, they wouldn't just be angry, they'd be afraid. And I don't mean fear in the sense of fists and yelling. No, I mean that cold, inescapable realization that the man they dismissed as insignificant has been the one holding the power all along. I'm getting ahead of myself. They ignored me, mocked me, treated me like I was nothing, only to discover far too late that I own the very ground they stand on. Let's start with my ex-wife, Vanessa. She used to love me. At least that's what she claimed. But in the end, she saw me as a burden, dragging her down. She left because I wasn't attractive enough, successful enough, or strong enough to be the man she had envisioned for herself. Her dreams were too grand, and I simply didn't fit into them, so she walked away, packed her things, moved on, and married Damon Carter, a well-dressed, influential man, a man she believed she deserved. I let it happen. No arguments, no chasing, no begging. While she was busy enjoying her new, extravagant life, I was building mine, brick by brick, deal by deal, step by step. I didn't just survive, I thrived. And here's the irony. For years, Vanessa, Damon, and all their high society friends have been living in my buildings. They think they're renting from some anonymous corporation. They think they're elite, that they've made it. They have no idea the luxurious penthouses they sip cocktails in belong to the man they left behind, me. Not just this one building, either. I own half the prime real estate in this part of the city, and yet Vanessa never notices me. She walks through the marble lobby, laughing with her husband, oblivious. She clinks her glass at rooftop parties, gazing at the skyline, thinking she's on top of the world. She has no idea she's living under my roof, but she's about to find out. It started with a chance meeting. I hadn't seen Vanessa in years. Not since the divorce. Not since she walked away, leaving me to pick up the pieces. That night, I was at the Meridian Club, a private lounge for the wealthy and powerful. The kind of place where people think they own the city. The kind of place where I own the walls. I was there for business. Then I heard her laugh. That sharp, high-pitched trill I recognized instantly. I turned, and there she was, seated at a table with Damon and their elite circle. And then I saw him, Damon Carter, her upgrade. He lounged back, whiskey in hand, speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear, holding court like the king he imagined himself to be. I wasn't paying attention until I heard my name. Vanessa leaned in, her hand on Damon's arm, her voice honeyed with amusement. Damon chuckled, shaking his head. That man was always a failure. Laughter erupted around. The table. I clenched my glass. Not because of what he said, I'd heard worse before, but because of how they laughed, like I was a joke, a footnote in Vanessa's past, a man who never mattered. Then Damon said the words that sealed his fate. Some men just don't have what it takes. I could have walked over, told him exactly who I was. Let him see the power I held. But that would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, I finished my drink, paid my bill, and walked out. With one thought in my mind, it was time. Time to show them exactly who they had underestimated. The eviction notices. I returned to my office that night, called my legal team, draft the eviction notices, not just for Damon and Vanessa's penthouse, for every single one of their friends in that club. They had spent years looking down on me, laughing at me, treating me like I was beneath them, but they had all been living under my roof, and now they had 30 days to get out. The next morning, the notices were hand-delivered. By lunchtime, the calls started pouring in. Vanessa, Damon, their friends, they were confused. then panicked, then furious, and then Damon showed up at my office. He stormed in, eviction notice clenched in his fist, slamming it onto my desk. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. I leaned back in my chair, calm, composed, watching as his world crumbled. "I thought you were a smart man, Damon." His jaw clenched. "This is a mistake," he growled. "There's no way you own this building." I stayed silent, letting the realization settle, letting him feel it. Then, finally, I leaned forward, hands clasped on the desk, voice cold and measured. "I own half the city, Damon, not just this building." His mouth opened slightly, but there was no laughter now. And then Vanessa walked in. Her face pale, eyes darting between us. "If this is about last night, Marcus, this isn't funny." I finally looked at her. "This isn't about last night, Vanessa." My voice was calm, controlled. "This is about the fact that I let you believe a lie." Confusion flickered across her face. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I took my time. Let the silence drag." Then I leaned back again. "I let you think I was a failure." Her lips parted. Her breath caught. "I let you go because I don't need someone who couldn't see my worth." Damon's fists clenched. "You can't do this," he snapped. I stood, adjusted my cufflinks, my voice sharp, unyielding. "I already have." Vanessa's eyes dropped to the paper in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she reread the signature at the bottom. My name. And in that moment I saw the truth dawn on her. She had left everything behind, for a man who had nothing, while the man she abandoned had everything. They tried to fight back, but it was already over. And as I stood on the rooftop of my skyscraper that night, looking down at the city I owned, I couldn't help but smile. They thought they had power. They thought they were untouchable. But they never realized the truth. I was never the failure. I was the landlord. And they were just tenants. And their lease was up. Pals. HT. And all of a sudden, Damon was no longer in charge of the social circle. He was a liability because he was unable to provide for himself. But the best thing, they weren't alone. All the individuals who made fun of me in that club were residents of one of my homes, and their notices were piling up. Damon started to lose control, and his social circle began to desert him. Vanessa had to watch the disintegration of her new life, while Marcus relished every moment. Every man eventually reaches a point in his life when he stops fighting and begins to panic. When his confidence starts slipping through his fingers like sand, denial gives way to desperation. Damon Carter was standing at the cliff's edge at that moment, and he had no idea that I had already shoved him. By the time word got out about their eviction, Damien's business partner's phone was ringing constantly. Everyone, even his investors and so-called friends, was curious as to how he let this happen. Because in their world, reputation is everything. And this wasn't just a story about a wealthy businessman losing his home. It was about a wealthy businessman being evicted from his own opulent home by another man. They all underestimated me. Damon, for example, never really had any friends, only allies who stuck around as long as there was something to gain. But now, Damien had nothing to offer, and his closest circle began to retreat, one by one. By noon, Richard Vaughn, a fellow real estate investor who had been collaborating with Damien on a deal, was the first to leave. The next day, Richard withdrew from their partnership, citing concerns about financial instability. Suddenly, Damien was a burden. Then came the second blow. His best friend, Gavin, one of the loudest people at the Meridian Club, the man who laughed at me the most, was now suddenly too busy to return Damon's calls. By the end of the day, Damon was in a bind. He had fallen from the highest position in society to a cautionary tale of public humiliation. Vanessa was used to stability. She left me because she wanted more prestige, fortune, and power. Damien had initially given that to her, but now she was learning the hard way. Damien wasn't stronger than me. He was weaker. I wasn't there when she first saw the news, but I could imagine her reaction, the sinking feeling in her stomach when she read the headlines. Damon Carter, his fall from grace. And the worst part? I made sure the articles never mentioned me. No one knew the identity of the landlord who had pulled the strings. By the third day, there was no safety net left. Damon had no control over the story. He was in full panic mode. So when his assistant sent me an email, I grinned. Of course, he reached out. He was finally beginning to understand. I wasn't a failure. I was never beneath him. I was the one holding the leash the entire time. When he asked to meet, I agreed. Not because I had anything to talk about, but because I wanted to watch him break. I arrived at the location I had chosen specifically for him, a place where he would feel trapped, surrounded by his own failure. He was already there, sitting behind his massive glass desk, trying to look composed. But his eyes gave him away. He was shaken. I entered calmly. He didn't say hello. I didn't sit. I let the silence stretch before he finally sighed. All right, Marcus, let's be men about this. I smiled. He went on about how this eviction was pointless, how bad the optics were, how we could work out a deal. What's your price? He asked. I raised an eyebrow. I don't need your money, Damon. His jaw tensed. I leaned forward. His hands tightened on his desk. I didn't say anything. Just told him to leave my building. Immediately. He hissed something under his breath. I grinned. Oh, Damon. That night, Vanessa showed up at my house. I knew she would. She looked smaller than I remembered. Frail. She muttered, "Please, let me talk." I let her in. She sat there in silence for a long time before finally looking up at me, her eyes filled with regret. I made a mistake. I leaned back. Which part? I asked. Thinking you were too good for me? Or leaving me to marry him? Her eyes closed. What do you want me to do with that, Vanessa? She swallowed hard. Don't do this, she whispered. This isn't about getting even. I exhaled. I let you go a long time ago, Vanessa. Her breath caught. Damien's eviction wasn't personal. This is just business, I told her. She looked at me for a long moment, then stood. So I guess this is it, she murmured. I nodded. Then, just before she turned to leave, I said one last thing. You know what makes Damien different from me? She hesitated. When you left me, I built an empire. I smiled. When Damien lost everything, he broke. Her face went white. I closed the door. I didn't need closure. I had already won. Damon and Vanessa's last days in that apartment were humiliating. He had spent years crafting his perfect life, and I took it away in a month. Not out of rage, not even for revenge.